She was out for her morning walk when a stranger's fist knocked her to the ground. He thought no one was watching. He was wrong. Elon Musk saw it all, and what happened next shook the world. The sun was barely up, and the street was empty except for the faint sound of birds overhead. Deborah tightened the strap of her windbreaker, the soft fabric rustling with each step. This was her routine, a peaceful walk through her neighborhood in Scottsdale, Arizona. It was her way of keeping active, clearing her mind, and feeling connected to the world. The houses were quiet, driveways empty, and the breeze was cool enough to hint that the heat of the day was still hours away. Deborah turned onto Millhouse Avenue, her favorite part of the route. A line of old oak trees stretched along the sidewalk, their branches arching like a cathedral overhead. She smiled to herself, appreciating these little moments of calm. That's when she saw him. The bike was sprawled across the sidewalk like it had been dropped in a hurry. The man stood beside it, pacing, his boots clicking on the concrete. Deborah slowed her pace instinctively. Something about his movements didn't feel right. Erratic, impatient. He kept glancing at his phone, then back up the street as if he were waiting for someone. His scowl deepened when he saw her approaching. "Excuse me," Deborah said softly, trying to pass. The man didn't budge. Instead, he stepped right into her path, blocking the way entirely. "Watch where you're going," he snapped. His voice was sharp, almost accusing. Deborah blinked, taken aback. "I'm just trying to get by," she replied, her voice steady but calm. "You old people think you own the sidewalk," he growled. Deborah frowned, feeling a knot form in her chest. "There's plenty of room for both of us," she said, attempting to sidestep him. But the man mirrored her movement, refusing to let her pass. For the first time in years, Deborah felt something she hadn't expected. Fear. She looked at him carefully. His clothes were disheveled, his jaw tight. There was something about the way he hovered over her, like a storm cloud ready to burst. "Please," she tried again, her voice firmer. "Let me through." The man's lip curled into a sneer. "What did you just say to me?" Deborah's heart skipped. She hadn't meant to challenge him, but the energy between them shifted. It was like a switch had flipped, and in that moment, Deborah knew something was very, very wrong. Something was about to happen that would change everything. Time seemed to stretch as Deborah stood her ground, her breath quickening. The man's eyes narrowed into thin, dark slits, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Something about his posture screamed volatility. She took a step back instinctively, her mind racing for the right words to de-escalate. "Look, I don't want any trouble," Deborah said, keeping her voice calm, though her pulse hammered in her ears. But he wasn't listening. Whatever had sparked this rage in him had already taken root, and now it was too late. "You think you're better than me, huh?" His voice was a low growl, like a fuse sizzling before the explosion. Deborah opened her mouth to respond, but before a single word escaped, it happened. His fist shot forward, a blur of motion that came out of nowhere. Deborah barely registered it before the impact landed square on her cheek. A hot, burning pain shot through her face, knocking her off balance. Her knees buckled, and in one sickening instant she was on the ground. The rough pavement scraped her palms as she tried to brace herself, gasping as the wind rushed from her lungs. For a moment, everything went silent. Deborah lay there, her mind trying to process what had just happened. Her cheek throbbed, her hand stung, and tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. Not from crying, but from sheer shock. The man loomed over her, his chest heaving, his lips curling into a twisted sneer of satisfaction. "Next time, stay out of my way," he muttered, stepping back toward his bike like nothing had happened. Deborah struggled to push herself upright. Her hands trembled, and anger swelled beneath her ribs. How could someone do this? How could a stranger, someone who didn't even know her, just lash out like that? "Help," she managed to whisper, though her voice sounded weak, almost foreign. And that's when she heard it, a car door slamming. Footsteps, purposeful, heavy, and growing louder with each stride. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The voice wasn't hers. It wasn't a neighbor's. It was deep, deliberate, and unmistakably commanding. Deborah turned her head slowly, squinting through the haze of pain and confusion. There he was, Elon Musk. At first, her brain didn't fully register it. How could it? Elon Musk, one of the most recognizable people in the world, was standing a few feet away in dark jeans and a crisp t-shirt, his face stone-cold serious. "Did you just hit her?" Musk barked, his gaze fixed on the man. The biker froze. For a moment he looked caught between fight and flight, his eyes darting to Elon, then back to his bike. "Mind your business," the man spat, though his voice faltered slightly. "Oh, it's my business now," Elon shot back. He raised his phone, the screen already recording. "You just assaulted a woman in broad daylight. You think I'm going to let you get away with that?" The man's face paled as he realized who he was dealing with. It wasn't just some bystander. It was him. Elon Musk, the billionaire. The man with more followers on social media than he could count. The weight of that reality hit like a sledgehammer. Deborah, still on the ground, could hardly believe what she was witnessing. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie. "Apologize to her. Now," Musk said sharply, his voice cutting through the tense air. The man hesitated, his jaw twitching. But as Elon stepped closer, the phone still held up and recording, the biker turned and muttered, "I'm sorry." It wasn't genuine. Deborah could hear that much. But it didn't matter. Musk had him backed into a corner. "Are you okay?" Musk asked, shifting his attention to Deborah as he knelt down beside her. Deborah nodded weakly, one hand still clutching her throbbing cheek. "I'll be fine," she managed, though her voice shook. "Don't worry, I've got this all on video," Musk assured her. "He's not getting away with it." The biker, sensing his escape slipping further away, grabbed his handlebars and bolted. The wheels screeched as he pedaled furiously down the street. Musk didn't chase him. Instead, he stood, watching the man disappear. Deborah pushed herself up to sit, feeling shaky but relieved. "Thank you," she said softly, looking up at him. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Musk replied, offering her a hand. "But I promise, this isn't over." Deborah had no idea how right he was. This was only the beginning. Deborah clutched Elon Musk's hand as she steadied herself on her feet. The pain still pulsed in her cheek, but the shock of the situation had overtaken it. Her mind spun with questions she couldn't articulate, but one thing was clear. Elon Musk had just saved her. Elon glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "You need to sit down. Here, let me help you to my car." She followed him in a daze, each step feeling heavier than the last. Elon opened the door of a sleek Tesla parked at the curb and gestured for her to take a seat. The interior smelled faintly of leather and something clean, like new machinery. Deborah sank into the seat with a soft exhale, her body finally allowing itself to feel how rattled she was. Outside, Elon stayed by the car, his phone still gripped tightly. He was calling the police. Deborah could hear snippets of his conversation, clear, no-nonsense words describing the attacker, his bike, and the direction he'd fled. It didn't take long before the first patrol car rolled up. The sound of sirens sliced through the once quiet neighborhood, a jarring reminder of what had just occurred. A young officer climbed out, notebook in hand, his eyes darting between Elon and the woman in the passenger seat. "Miss, are you all right?" he asked, his voice measured but concerned. "I think so," Deborah murmured, her hand still lightly pressed to her cheek. The adrenaline had begun to wear off, leaving behind a dull ache. "She was assaulted," Elon cut in firmly, stepping toward the officer. "I caught everything on video. You'll want to see this." He lifted his phone, tilting the screen to reveal the recording. The officer's expression shifted as he watched. His brow creased, and his lips pressed into a hard line. "We'll get this guy, sir. Do you have a description?" "I've already given it to dispatch," Elon replied, folding his arms across his chest. There was something about his demeanor, calm yet quietly intense, that made even the officer stand a little straighter. While Elon handed over the video, Deborah stayed in the car, watching the scene unfold. For years, she'd walked this same route without a second thought. Never in her life had she been attacked, much less punched, in her own neighborhood. But here she was, sitting in a Tesla owned by the most famous entrepreneur on the planet, watching police take statements as if her morning had been part of some strange, hyper-real dream. "Ma'am," the officer said gently as he approached the car, "we'll need you to come down to the station later to give a full statement." "Are you sure you're okay to leave now?" Deborah nodded faintly. I'll be fine. Thank you. The officer gave her a small nod before heading back to his cruiser, where he began relaying the details to dispatch. Elon returned to the driver's side of the Tesla and leaned in. "Let me take you home," he said. His tone was soft, but there was no arguing with it. "Thank you for everything," Deborah whispered. Elon didn't respond immediately. Instead, he climbed into the car, started the engine, and the Tesla glided down the street with quiet precision. As they drove, Deborah stared out the window, watching the familiar houses blur past. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly. Elon glanced at her, his face unreadable. "Because no one deserves to be treated like that," he replied simply. "And because I could." Deborah turned that over in her mind. Because I could. Such a simple answer, yet it resonated. How many people had seen her struggle and just looked away? If Elon Musk hadn't been there, would anyone have stepped in? "I've never been part of anything like this," she admitted, her voice quiet. "Well," Elon said, a hint of something almost playful in his voice, "you're about to be part of a lot more." Deborah frowned. "What do you mean?" Elon smiled faintly as he turned onto a street. "Let's just say this video isn't staying private." And just like that, Deborah's quiet life was about to be turned upside down. The world was about to see what happened, and nothing would be the same after that. Deborah had barely set foot in her modest living room when her phone buzzed. Once, twice, then it wouldn't stop. She sank onto her couch, the familiar fabric grounding her in the surreal chaos of the day. She rubbed her aching cheek and glanced at her phone. Missed calls, text messages, from friends, neighbors, even a niece she hadn't spoken to in months. "Deborah, are you okay? You're all over the internet." Her heart dropped. Before she could process, there was a knock at her door. Firm, steady. Deborah's pulse quickened. Not again. She hesitated, but then heard a voice from outside. "It's me, Elon." Deborah opened the door slowly, still unsure how to navigate the fact that Elon Musk, was standing on her front porch. He held out a small bag. "I brought you ice packs and some aspirin. You'll want these." "Thank you," Deborah said softly, ushering him inside. As she settled onto the couch with the ice pressed gently against her cheek, Elon took a seat across from her. He was scrolling through his phone, the blue light reflecting faintly in his eyes. "It's already going viral," he said. Deborah swallowed. "What is?" He turned the screen toward her. The video of the assault, clear, high-resolution, unshakable evidence of what had happened, was plastered across social media. The caption read, "Man punches elderly woman. Elon Musk intervenes and exposes him. Justice will be served." Deborah stared at the video, unable to look away. In just a few hours, it had racked up millions of views, thousands of comments. Strangers, people she didn't know, were furious on her behalf. "Coward. What kind of man hits an older woman? Elon, you're a hero for stepping in." She felt a lump rise in her throat. "I didn't want this," she whispered. "I didn't ask for this." Elon nodded. "I get it, but sometimes the world needs to see things like this." Deborah met his gaze. "Why?" "Because it wakes people up," he said simply. "There's too much ugliness people ignore. This guy? He thought no one would stop him, no one would care. But now, everyone cares. He's not going to get away with it." Deborah let those words sink in. A part of her didn't want the attention, didn't want to be a headline. But deep down, she couldn't deny the truth. If no one had seen, if no one had cared, that man would still be out there, fists ready, waiting for his next victim. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a call. She answered hesitantly. "Deborah? It's Margaret from Channel 6 News. We'd love to talk to you about this morning's incident." Deborah hung up, her hand trembling slightly. Elon tilted his head. "It's going to be like that for a while." The next 2 days were a blur. News outlets ran the story across every network. Footage of the attack played on loop, alongside headlines praising Elon Musk for intervening. "Hero billionaire steps in to save elderly woman." Except Deborah didn't feel saved. She felt exposed. She stopped answering her phone. She turned off the TV. Every knock at the door made her flinch. Her quiet life had been shattered, and the world, strangers with opinions, praise, and anger, had moved in where peace used to be. But on the third day, something unexpected happened. There was a knock, softer this time. Deborah opened the door to find a small bouquet of flowers on her porch. Attached was a note. "You're stronger than you think. Thank you for reminding us all to care. A stranger." Deborah stood there for a long moment, staring at the flowers. The lump in her throat returned, but this time it wasn't from fear or anxiety. It was something else. Something like hope. She looked out toward the street, where life seemed to continue as normal. But something had changed, hadn't it? Not just for her, for a lot of people, and she was finally ready to see it for herself. 3 weeks later, the bruises on Deborah's cheek had faded, but the incident had left a mark far deeper than anything visible. She still took her morning walks, though her steps were more cautious now. Friends had offered to walk with her, but Deborah politely refused. "I'm not going to let one man steal my independence," she'd say firmly. The attack, Elon Musk's intervention, and the viral storm that followed had reshaped her world. Strangers sent messages of support. Some shared their own experiences of being mistreated, ignored, or hurt. For Deborah, it was a strange comfort to know she wasn't alone, that what happened to her mattered, not just to her, but to the world. She saw Elon's video again, this time not with dread, but with understanding. It wasn't just a recording of her pain. It was evidence, proof that people like her, ordinary, invisible people, were worth standing up for. Then came the court date. Deborah sat at the front of the courtroom, her hands steady in her lap. The man who'd hit her stood a few feet away, looking smaller than she remembered. He avoided her eyes as the judge reviewed the case. Elon hadn't needed to be there, but he showed up anyway. Dressed simply, he sat quietly at the back of the room, watching. His presence sent a message without him needing to say a word. When the judge handed down the sentence, community service, anger management, and a hefty fine, Deborah exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was justice, and that was enough. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered like bees. Deborah walked past them, her head high. When one asked if she had anything to say, she paused, looking into the sea of cameras. "I want people to remember this," she said clearly. "Standing up for someone, anyone, can change everything. Elon didn't have to help me, but he did. And I hope more people will do the same when they see someone in trouble." A reporter shouted, "Do you have a message for the man who hurt you?" Deborah considered the question, then nodded. "I hope he learns something from this, and I hope he chooses to be better." That night she received a call. It was Elon. "I saw your interview," he said. "You did good." "Thank you," Deborah replied softly. "You know," Elon continued, "the whole world watched what happened that day. People will forget the headlines eventually, but they won't forget the lesson." Deborah smiled faintly. "I hope so." She hung up and looked out her window, where the evening sun had turned the sky gold. The world felt a little quieter now, a little gentler, not because the world had changed, but because she had. She picked up her sneakers from the corner and laced them up. Tomorrow she'd take her walk again, alone. Not because she was fearless, but because she refused to let fear win. As she opened the door, she whispered to herself, "One step at a time," and she stepped outside. Here's what you should learn from this story. Never underestimate the power of standing up for someone, no matter how small the moment may seem. It takes one person to make a difference. If this story moved you, don't just scroll by. Next time you see someone struggling, whether it's a neighbor, a stranger, or a friend, be the one who steps up. You never know whose life you might change.